Good afternoon, and welcome to the final session of the Placemaking Conference. I am Debra Richards, an assistant professor in the Division of Architecture at the Christopher C. Gibbs College of Architecture. Along with other faculty in the college, I've been working with students and through my own research at OU to explore methods in which designers can engage with a community's history or stories to create impactful and sustainable placemaking projects. The stories of a community reveal their community-identified assets, history, identities, dreams, which can all be framed as resources to create projects which may not have funding. Our next speaker engages with communities in a cross-disciplinary way to encourage and connect the strengths of a community to realize impactful placemaking projects and relationships between community members. Honored as a Bruskoff Chair of Creative Architecture, our final speaker is Rick Lowe. I had the honor of hosting Rick Lowe this weekend as one of the speakers participating in the project Northeast Oklahoma City Storytelling Project, which was led by Black Space Oklahoma and was co-sponsored by the University of Oklahoma College of Architecture. Rick is a Houston-based artist who has developed transformative community-based projects. He is well known for the project Row Houses in Houston's 3rd Ward, one of the city's oldest African-American neighborhoods. Rick worked with community and artists to rehabilitate an area of existing neglected row houses and reimagined how they were both tied to the community's history and could play a role in shaping art programs and social engagement. Currently, Rick is leading a team of artists in Tulsa on the Greenwood Art Project, funded by the Bloomberg Philanthropies 2018 Art Challenge. The project is intended to celebrate the historic Greenwood District as well as known as Black Wall Street. The project will remember the 1921 race massacre where 300 African Americans lost their lives. But the project focuses on the cultural and economic strengths of the community. Rick is contributing his expertise and a framework for the project, relying on local artists and the community for their input, history, stories, and values. Rick has been the recipient of numerous awards, including being honored as a MacArthur Fellow, honored as President Barack Obama's appointment to the National Council on the Arts, a Lowe Fellow at Harvard, and a Mel Kim Fellow at MIT. Please help me welcome Rick Lowe.
Thank you very much. It's been a long day, huh? It's, yeah, so we just have a little bit more to go. Okay, so, you know, I said that I was going to not, okay, I generally, I just kind of jump in and start, but because of the richness of the conversations today, it's very, very, very interesting, and I just thought I would just kind of throw out, before I get started, some of the things that that I think about in doing the work that I'm doing in the so-called placemaking arena. But before I do that, I want to frame it, though, with something, to just give you something to think about, though, and you can think about this throughout as I talk about these projects. Has anybody ever heard of the chicken and the pig story? Nobody knows, you probably don't know my chicken and pig story, but so I'm going to tell you about it. Some years ago, when I first started with Project Row Houses, there was a person about my age. He had a little cafe, and he ended up running for state office. He won. I started Project Row Houses around the same time, and we were kind of friends, but he kind of drifted off. And then I would hear that he would say, you know, in private conversations, he would speak poorly about the work that was happening at Project Row Houses. But over time, eventually, he saw that the work that we were doing was impactful, and he eventually started to support us. And so in the process there, he finally said, you know, if we're going to work together, we need to clear the air between us. I said, okay, let's meet for coffee. So I met him, and he sat me down. He says, you know the story of the chicken and the pig? And I said, no. And he said, well, there was this farm where this this farmer had lots of farm animals, and for some reason the chicken and the pig became, best buddies, and they hung out all the time. And one day the chicken, who was very chatty, decided to, he went over to the pig and he says, "Aren't you tired of eating all this hay and stuff and seeds they always feed us? It's like, we should eat something different, for breakfast." And the pig said, "Like what?" And the chicken kind of tossed around and he said, "I got it. Bacon and eggs." And the pig kind of went, "Wait a minute. No. I mean, you're just going to lay your little golden egg and go on, but I'm going to have to lose, I've got skin in this thing. It's like, no, that's not a good idea." And so he was trying to make a point to me. He says, "My family's been in this neighborhood for 4 generations, and you came along and you have this good idea and you're doing this thing and whatever, but I've got skin in this. The folks here, you can, if you lay your egg here and it works, you're going to celebrate and it's going to go fine. But if it doesn't, you're going to move on, you're going to go somewhere else." And that was something that was really impactful for me, and it started me, I already kind of knew this, but he put it forth in a way that forced me to start thinking about these things, right? So start thinking about these questions of the issue of, the role of outsiders versus insiders, individuals versus collectives. And, that becomes important because we have to kind of, as people that are going in to do quote-unquote placemaking, we have to remember that generally places already exist. For somebody, they exist. And so we have to adjust our attitudes and our approach based on that. Brian Stevenson, who is the attorney that works with death row inmates, and he started this museum that deals with lynching and stuff down in Montgomery, Alabama. One of the things he talks about important in his work is to understand the value of proximity to the people that he's representing. And because the thing is that, if you're representing someone on death row and you have no understanding, no relationship, no sense of what their experiences are, it's really hard to get to the root of representing them impactfully. And I think that's, I love that idea. But also that idea can be also somewhat, a little bit dangerous. Because oftentimes when we say, well, I've been in this neighborhood for a long time. I'm a part of this. Well, there's always somebody else who feel like they have a little bit more skin in it. And as the kind of quote-unquote professional class, we have to be able to acknowledge that and allow this, and find our role, the proper role as someone from the outside who's coming in. And also, but do it in a way that really shows the value of what an outsider can bring without it, diminishing the importance of the insider. So, and that's similarly with the idea of the individual in the collective. We're so much about what it means for collective activity and things that happen. But, the truth of the matter is, strong individuals are incredibly important for the collective because they can, they can give vision and inspire, passion among that collective. So I never try to shy away from those things of being an outsider or an individual that's working within a collective, but you just have to understand that. Now, this is, the work that I do is kind of centered on this work, on this term that Joseph Beuys coined in the 1970s called social sculpture. That's defined as the way that we shape our neighborhoods, our communities, or whatever. But key to that that's important is that, he talks about how everybody is an artist. And I'm going to hit on that a little bit. It was very nice to hear, I think it was Jill and Dylan both speak about that in their presentations about the importance of, the people who, and when those people, when you can see how those people are impacted or how they produce in the context of the work that's happening. And Joseph Beuys, as I said, he said, everybody is an artist, so we have to find that. But then this notion of placemaking, then it brings up these questions for me about, whose place is being made. Where are those places being made? Oftentimes, I remember back in the early 90s as, we were beginning to think more broadly about art and where it could be and who it could impact and the role it could play or whatever. I remember being at a meeting about public art, and this guy stood up, and it was really quite funny. He says, you know, everybody was talking about where the art should be and all this, and he said, well, I want to see public art in the ugly places, you know, because so often we get caught up in this idea of, you know, we want art in all the cool places that we go, but what about the places that don't have that, you know? And then, you know, who gets to make it? You know, it's not just the outsiders. They're the insiders that have stuff to contribute there. And so, and then key to that about who gets to make it is, you know, who gets to decide the aesthetics. And that's a real key issue. You can see that, I see that constantly in the neighborhoods that I work in, where oftentimes, I mean, I always tell the story about people coming in and, you know, they're interested in pedestrian, you know, the idea of making a neighborhood pedestrian-oriented or bike-oriented or whatever. And they want to, you know, they come in, they want to do, you know, bike lanes and this kind of stuff. And our neighborhood is like, we don't need bike lanes. We know how to ride our bikes in our neighborhood, you know, because it's something that people already do. And so it's a different kind of aesthetic and a different kind of need for a different neighborhood. And so, you know, I think those things are important. So I'm hoping that all those questions will resonate as I talk about, you know, these projects here that I'm going to talk about. The first one is Project Row Houses, which, and let me just say this too. Dylan talked about this, that art or placemaking is about creating narratives. And that's the work that I do. It is about narrative, making a narrative between something and trying to figure that out to give people something to hold on to. The mayor talked about that earlier, about how do you give people something to hold on to talk about their place in a way that's different than the usual negatives that they may confront all the time. This was a negative in Third Ward of Houston, in which, you know, this area at the bottom here was considered one of the, is that the clicker? Nope. Nope, that's not it. Anyway, well, the house is at the bottom there. It was considered one of the worst places in the entire neighborhood, and they wanted to take it down. How do I get rid of that? And where's the dot thing? It's the top. Oh, okay, it's the top one. Okay, good. Okay. Yeah, it was. They said it was one of the worst parts of the neighborhood, and they wanted it torn down, which, you know, I agreed with it in the beginning, but then I later went back and I found this guy's work, John Biggers, who is an African American artist who did a lot of work in the you know 1950s, 60s around this notion of shotgun houses, shotgun communities, and he made these incredible paintings showing them in ways that most people didn't talk about them in that way, about the vibrancy of them and the community that they embodied, and so I ended up talking to him and realizing that he had a different historical framework for the shotgun house. He had traced the origin of the architecture type to West Africa, and that it moved with the slave trade into the U.S. And so then I decided that maybe I could take this as an opportunity to build a social sculpture, and started with these 22 little shotgun houses, and tried to infuse these elements that John Biggers talked about that made a shotgun house community vital. Those elements were good and relevant architecture, art and creativity or culture, education, and a social safety net. And then later I kind of figured out the whole sustainability part. But in the development of these 22 houses, those were the things we tried to do. It was just simply to honor the architecture, and then develop a program that engaged artists on an ongoing basis to come into our community and share their creativity as a way of connecting other people in the neighborhood to creativity. And then education, working with youth, developing a youth program that worked with youth to get them out and have them kind of understand how to transform community. And then there was we did a transitional housing program for single mothers. And all this is happening within these 22 houses, so it became kind of like a little community in itself. All, you know, with artists doing art projects, youth programs, transitional housing program for single mothers, and so on and so forth. That led to, the complete renovation of these 22 little houses, but it also provided an opportunity to look at, what the architecture of this neighborhood could look like in a modern sense. And so we worked with architects to, come up with these kind of designs here to look at the, a modern kind of version of the shotgun house. And in these two sets of images here, you can kind of see that we're also playing with the idea of public and private, and trying to understand what it means to have a kind of public place, but within a private neighborhood. So that became a key issue there. But then, of course, once you kind of make a little bit of success there, then you have to deal with the consequences of that. And real estate values start to go up, and larger housing, more market rate housing and stuff that was out of the range of the people that that was in the neighborhood when we came in. And so we responded by continuing to work with architects to look at the architectural language that we could offer as a counterbalance to the traditional townhouse model that we saw that was kind of coming through. Now, the advantage of this particular project was that, it was one that, was initiated by, it was initiated without a particular time frame. So we were able to kind of spend the time that we needed and work with artists and kind of learn the community and really become a vital part of it, so that we didn't necessarily have to do outreach because we were in it. We were a part of it. And that's, that's one of the great play on, kind of advantages and disadvantages for me in the work that I do. It's about time, and what kind of structure you're working in. And so now I'm going to shift a little bit to a project in Dallas. It's called Translation Vickery Meadow. This is a different kind of framework. I was invited by the museum there, the National Sculpture Center, to create a sculptural piece for them. And but they knew I would do something in the social context. So they took me to this neighborhood, Vickery Meadow, which was apparently in the early 1970s. They started building all these apartment complexes. This blue here is basically all apartments. In fact, in that area, I think it was it's like between 40 and 50,000 apartment units, and very dense, but built around this kind of apartment living environment, right? It was built mostly people that were living in these houses were recent college grads that were first time living on their own in their apartments or whatever. And this was during a time when, we still have that in Dallas and in Houston, well, here as well, car culture, where, people don't get out and so you don't spend a lot of effort on public space because it's all kind of internal. And so this is kind of the heyday of Vickery Meadow with all these apartment housing. But then over time, depreciation happened, and all of a sudden, it's not the hip place to live any longer. And lower income people start moving in. In fact, in response to the Fair Housing Act, they kind of shifted a lot of these apartments from being a lot of one bedroom or studio apartments to providing larger families in. And but what's really interesting about it, though, is that you start to, in the current context now, you can see how the amenities on the streets are just not there. Oftentimes there's no sidewalks, but they weren't built for that because people didn't need them when they were designing and building this. And then now, it's been defined as one of the most dangerous places in Dallas, and it was the first time I had seen this kind of thing with the police towers and stuff looking over neighborhoods and this whole sense of crime there a lot. But one of the things that was interesting about this neighborhood, though, was that it had transformed from this place that was really hip and great to be, that everybody wanted to live at, to a place that had a kind of a diversity that I hadn't really seen around. And the reason for that was that apparently the International Refugee Committee and Catholic Charities seized upon the opportunity that there were so many apartments there that there were always going to be vacancies, so they could place refugees, and immigrants started to come there. And so this neighborhood went from pretty much so an all-white, young population to one of loads of refugees and immigrants. And what's troubling about that for me is that, you know, we champion the idea of diversity, but then when we get diversity, then there's nothing, we don't have anything positive to attach to that. And so I was trying to figure that out and trying to, you know, understand, you know, what's the value behind that and what's the meaning behind that. So the way that I generally work is I try to always work with teams of people that have some relationship with local communities. These are all people, folks from Dallas that joined my team to go out and do research and explore. And one of the things that we found was that there was a group of women who represented churches. They decided that the narrative of violence of Vickery, Meadow was probably misplaced a little bit in how it got there. You know, people would say that, you know, all these immigrants and these folks are just, you know, they're killing people, they're robbing, and they're doing this stuff. And they're also subject to a lot of crime. And so, but these women said, well, maybe the problem is that we got all these people here that's never been in the U.S., they don't know the place, and maybe they just need to get to know each other. So they started this thing they call the Mom's Lunch, in which they would bring together 5 or 6 women from 5 or 6 different countries on Wednesdays, and they would just have lunch. And they would share stories about their journeys and that kind of stuff. And I managed to get them to let me go to one. It was amazing. It was one of the most beautiful experiences I've ever been in, where, you know, people were sitting there and pouring their hearts out about their lived experiences and really celebrating each other. You know, it was really quite beautiful. And they would each week a different group would actually provide the food, and they would have some kind of cultural element to it. So then I thought, well, maybe what this situation needs, it needs some kind of public gathering opportunity. And I thought about how people generally in the places that I've gone to, where a lot of the folks, the immigrants are from there, you know, they're accustomed to markets, you know, and I thought, well, maybe we should do a market space for these folks and see how that could, you know, kind of take the same kind of experience that was happening within that room of, you know, maybe 30 to 40 women and put it in a more public context. Well, first of all, we had to figure out what do we do, what's in the market, what can we provide in a market for people, and we tried to talk to people door to door, asking people if they made crafts and stuff, and if they wanted to participate in a market, and nobody really understood what we were getting at. So we decided, well, we needed to open a space, and so we got a couple of apartments in the heart of the neighborhood, and we just opened studios, in which we had, mostly it was Dallas artists in the beginning teaching workshops, but very clearly, quickly, once people saw what we were talking about just making things, then people started showing up, and there were so many people that had things that they could teach and that they wanted to offer. And so we said, okay, well, after several months of doing these workshops and making things, we said, okay, we can try this market. But we got a lot of pushback from a lot of the social service providers who were skeptical, saying that people wouldn't come out because they're afraid. And then, of course, the museum people said that our museum people are not going to go because they're not going to go to Vickery Meadow, they're scared. And but we thought we would do it anyway, and we'd organize it around food. And we called it the Lucky Pot. And it was amazing because we thought that we were hopeful if we could get maybe, 5 or 6 different groups to bring food, and we didn't expect anything like this, but it turned out to be 18 different countries representing with their food, people telling stories. The one at the bottom here was really fantastic here with the, I don't know what part of Africa she was from, but she was telling stories in her language. This woman is from Bhutan, I think, and she was telling, it was really interesting to see them in kind of in action there. And so once we did this one, we started to see how people were coming together. We said, okay, well, let's, expand it. So we decided to, to break it out. Someone suggested a talent show, which we were a little bit skeptical of, but we ended up giving it a shot. and made this kind of goofy flyer with all these different languages on it because someone said that people just needed to see themselves represented in it. So some of it just says hello, and that kind of stuff in different languages. And so we decided to do this talent show, and also we could bring more of the crafts to the market. And once again, keeping our expectations low because we didn't, it's better to be pleasantly surprised than disappointed. So we decided that, we were shooting for getting, maybe 10, people to sign up for this talent show, but it turned out to be way beyond what we imagined with loads of people showing. I think we had over close to 30 participants in the talent show, and it just went on and on and on. It ranged from, like a 12-month-old, year-old little Somalia girl, like kind of doing something on stage to a 87-year-old white guy doing the hokey pokey. It was like, and everything in between. It was this kind of really interesting dynamic of seeing people too, how all the different, people that have people performing, they're waiting for their performance to go up, but they're also engaging with the performers that are there at the time. So after doing these markets a bit, then we decided, well, there were artists who were who were immigrants or refugees that actually did things that were of a higher level than being just in a market situation. So I'd had a conversation with. So we were trying to figure out how can we present like somebody who makes nice paintings, somebody who makes things that are a bit different. So I was thinking about that, and I was talking to a friend of mine, Mark Bradford, who's in LA. He's a very well-known artist, but he was having his first show at White Cube Gallery in London. And we were talking, and he talked about how one of his paintings was going to go for over $1 million. And we talked about how the marketing and commercialization of the white cube as something that was significant to adding value. And so as I was, talking to him, I kind of said, well, we need a white cube gallery in Vickery, Meadow for all of our artists. Can we elevate the value of these things by having white cube there? So I went back and I talked to an architect who had been doing a lot of work in the area, and I said, can you guys just design a white cube for us? I mean, we just want something that's, it could be like 12 by 12 feet or something, but it's got to have this white walls that really fit this whole notion of the white cube gallery kind of thing. And to my surprise, they came back with these really great little simple spaces that were really quite beautiful. And the thing I hadn't really considered as we were doing this, we started to place them along the street because we were in the interior of the neighborhood, and people would come into the neighborhood, but for the people that were walking, there was nothing for them along the way. So all of a sudden, these little white cube galleries became places for people to kind of see things and do things along the way, and so they're used for all kinds of exhibitions. Some of them are much more active and engaged, and in fact, it was very interesting how when we were first talking about doing it, another thing with a lot of naysayers saying, oh, well, you can't just have those things out there white, people are going to graffiti them and that kind of stuff, and none of that stuff ever happened. But they did become places where, there were places of social gathering, and also they served as like bus stops for people too. Shelters that when people are waiting on the bus and stuff. But it also did something else interesting, and it's this kind of hits to the challenge that we had. That I had an exhibition time frame that we were working on under, which meant that we had to hit the ground running and try to get something framed up for an exhibition, which meant that we didn't have time to understand the politics and the dynamics, the real estate dynamics, the place dynamics that were happening there. And so some of those unintended consequences that happened fairly quickly in this project was that the positive press that we were getting for this translation project in Vickery, Meadow was pretty great because the museum was pumping it, so it was and the real estate market just took complete advantage of that. And they took that as an opportunity to start investing in some of their properties and pushing the rents up, and it just kind of start moving people out of the area. Which then we had to kind of refocus ourselves and to move back into something, because we didn't want to play a role with that, so we closed down the white cubes, and we said we have to focus more internally and do that internal work that we didn't have time to do beforehand, of working directly with the people in these kind of workshop settings where it's not about trying to make a public face for the project, but it's really about, you know, serving the folks that are on the inside. Now I'm going to shift to Athens, Greece. This is another kind of, oh, and by the way, that project in Dallas went from end of 2012 to 2018. So it was a good run, and it was, you know, so it went like 4 years beyond the exhibition time. This one is, this project was put together as a part of Documenta, which is a big exhibition that happens every 5 years in Germany. Usually it's in Kassel, Germany. However, the director of the exhibition decided that he would split the project between Kassel and Athens. And I started on this project after my first visit to Athens, which was in June of 2015. June of 2015 was an incredibly dynamic moment in that in Greece. It was and in Athens in particular. But it was a time in which the referendum was up whether they would stay in the EU. There was a financial crisis. The banks were run on the banks, and there were lines of people trying to get money out of banks. There were the borders were open. Refugees were coming in. It was just like crazy time. I just happened to be there at that time for something unrelated to this. But when I was invited to come to work on this project, I wanted to explore that. So I started talking to people, and immediately people start telling me about this area called Victoria Square. And Victoria Square is an interesting place because it became kind of ground zero for symbolically for the refugee crisis. Because what had happened, Victoria Square is like a very small square within central Athens. And, but for some reason, throughout the region, it became known as the place that that refugees or immigrants should try to go to. And so they all just flooded this square, and it became like camps. I mean, there were camps all over. And the challenge, though, with this place being there was that there were like, you know, traditional Greek businesses all around the square. You know, and people went from kind of normal serving their, you know, tea and coffee or their restaurant stuff or selling this and that in their neighborhood to all of a sudden having, you know, hundreds and hundreds of you know, people that are sleeping and living in the park, which is very challenging and complicated. And then it was complicated by the fact that, you know, there were a lot of people that were, you know, saw it as an obligation, a humanitarian obligation to try to help support and take care of these folks. But then there was the conservative fascist party that was sending people out that were beating people up. So it was like this whole kind of weird, you know, dynamic happening there. And the dynamic, as I saw it when I went, was it was kind of a triangle, in that the real big problem there was with the refugees coming in. And so the Greek natives had a problem with the refugees coming in. But then they would also pass on some of that problem to the the immigrants. And then the immigrants start, you know, pushing against the refugees. So it was this kind of strange dynamic there. And I wanted to try to, this is just a scene of the kind of shops in the square. And these are folks that are all, you know, kind of hovered around the square. And this is actually was an act that the business owners pulled together to do to push the mayor to kind of respond to them, where all these signs here, that were on every business along the square that were basically saying, our business is for sale, because they were saying they could not operate their business without, you know, a cleanup of the square. And so I took that I took that triangle of complications as a way of saying, you know, how do you get folks to talk? You know, how do you get them to kind of see beyond this immediate tension and give some relief to them, so that they can at least find the humanity in the people that they're dealing with. And so I started in my usual way of talking to lots of people, but also mapping the place, you know, and trying to understand, you know, what's there. So this is the square here, the square's here. So we're just mapping all the different kind of services and things that are around, and then start slowly mapping the businesses and stuff. And then I ended up, I just made this decision that, you know, I really just thought it was something simple could contribute to this. It's just having a space where people could come together and share, somewhat like we were doing with the markets, but not even that. You know, I just thought we just need a place for people to come together to share. And this is something where, you know, I'm not an architect, designer, or anything like that, but I always say that, you know, the best architecture is the result of also, you know, a good architect, but also a good client. And I generally consider myself a pretty good client of kind of understanding how space work and how people in a space actually operate. And so my immediate, when I started talking about getting a space there, most of the people were recommending that that we find a space here on the square, which is, you know, where the refugees have been pushed out, but it was still like a lot of that square is always busy because people actually now, even to this day, the ones that are still living in the camps, they get on buses or trains or whatever, and they come to sit in the square. It's a gathering place for them. But I wanted a place that was a little bit quieter. And so as I looked around, I sat and I started watching how people would leave the train stop here. And instead of going down the main streets here when they get off, they would go and they would kind of navigate down this little street here. And then I realized there were basically a lot of people were kind of avoiding the main street, and this was a more pedestrian space. And so I found this building here, right at that corner. It had big windows, lots of graffiti on it. It was an abandoned building, but it had all the kind of architectural bones, I think, of a place that people would want to be and want to gather. And so I took the leap of faith there to take that space because a lot of people warned too that this was also a hotbed for the Golden Dawn, which was the fascist party, and in Athens that people don't, you know, I mean, between the anarchists and the Golden Dawn party, I mean, it's a regular occurrence with, you know, windows smashing and that kind of stuff. But I thought, you know, symbolically we needed to take this and work with it. And so we took this space and we just kind of working with people. I mean, we started out, we just got rid of the graffiti, whitewashed it, and just started, you know, we brought a few chairs over. People were curious about what we were doing. They started bringing us chairs. Artists start showing up. You know, one artist brought us a silk screen, her whole silk screen studio. She put it over, and we were able to start getting people in, doing workshops, and making that space kind of a living room for people and giving them access to it. And so this space began to, you know, to kind of operate as this place where folks could kind of, you know, show up and bring their wares and their opportunities. But then what was also I found that was interesting about the space, and I wasn't so much thinking about this at the time, but it turns out, you know, that pedestrian street, all of a sudden, I mean, that's a great performance space and an activity space that has become a key part of this project that has expanded it from just the interior of that space, but into the street where there are conversations. You know, there's loads. I mean, there's a team that works on this, and every week there are different people that come in. They do these informal. They just cook outside and they set up and folks eat. We end up doing this newspaper that would actually feature some of the businesses because we were really concerned about getting the Greek natives to speak about what they were feeling and not just hold it in. And we couldn't even get them to talk to each other. So we decided instead of trying to do it in a physical sense, let's just start a newspaper. So we started this newspaper one-to-one. In the beginning, it took us a long time to get folks to sign on to it until we got this one restaurant person who had been there for a long time, thought it was such a great idea that he went out and he used this network to pull people. And so we ended up with all these, almost everybody around the square ended up being a part of this one-to-one newspaper. And these are just some examples of how the street, you know, turns into this public space in ways that people can come together from different perspectives. Things like this is I think this is the Georgians, what they call Visavanka Day, which turned out to be a fashion show, but the one at the bottom there is a traditional Greek chorus. I think this is Africa Night or something like that. There's a gallery space that we also operate there to show kind of more traditional and finished work. But at the same time also, we use the conversation and interactions that we're doing to actually leverage the brain power of those people that are planners and community organizers to help shape, to use all that coming together to shape a future for this neighborhood in which we could kind of use it as develop a platform through which we can advocate on behalf of this neighborhood. And it's been fairly successful at this in the sense that, all the politicians have been so responsive. And it's like Dylan was saying how, you take these small things and it could have meaning that's much bigger. This is a very small project in Athens, but I can't tell you how many times the mayor, just different occasions in which he comes to events because he's trying to figure out how to place himself within the context of this, what's happening with how we're dealing with the whole refugee situation. Then, and also this person at the top is Kyriakis, who's the head of the Conservative Party, who's likely to be the next prime minister there. Just to go back and just say a little bit about, so as I said with Project Row Houses, you get a little success and then you have the challenges of how do you deal with that. And that's been the challenge of Project Row Houses. Now there are all these townhouses everywhere. Real estate values have gone up from when we started, in the early 90s from $1 a square foot to, over $55 a square foot now. And we've responded to that by, being a vehicle through which the community could come together and plan and kind of set forth an agenda going forward. But even though with the large plan kind of situation, this, it falls back to the individuals, and that's what the speakers earlier were talking about. This was an example of me kind of just honoring a person who was considered an outsider. He plays his saxophone and stuff, and people thought of him as an odd person, but I ended up just documenting him and making a poster to show him in a way in which he might be adding some value, which he would always be playing his saxophone at these buildings that were burning in the neighborhood, which lots of them were at the time. And then this guy, Eugene Howard, he called himself brother-in-law. There's a long story behind that, but he had been in prison for many years and made his over 25 years, and he got out, came back to the neighborhood, and was trying to figure out how he could, set his life straight and not, end up going back to jail. So he somebody told him he should go and hang out at Project Row Houses, if he wanted to stay out of trouble, because we would help him out. Well, he did. And he would come and hang out, and eventually I started kind of I took interest in him because he's such a great guy. He has this great smile, a good energy. So he started cleaning up for us, just taking trash out and stuff. And once in a while I would give him a few dollars here and there. And each time he would always come back with a big plate of barbecue. And I would say, I wasn't asking you to do that for us. It was just for you to do what you want. And he said, no, I like doing that. So after about 4 years of this guy being around, I thought, this guy's really special. Where's the disconnect in his life, that he's haven't been able to live up to his fullest potential. And so one day I asked him, I said, brother-in-law, if you could start your life over again, what do you think you would have done? What would have been your, what would have been your thing? And he said, well, I like cooking, so I would have probably liked to have had a cafe. So I thought, maybe I should do a poster of him in the way that he thought of himself, in his best self. And so I went back and I made this poster of him, brother-in-laws, with this big smile and all. And he was like, and we start placing it around, and people were like really, people were so into it. Everybody in the neighborhood would recognize him through this poster and stuff. And then we started to pay him to cook things for Project Row Houses when we were having little events and stuff. And it just kind of grew and mushroomed into this whole thing, a little industry of brother-in-laws where he would, he ended up having, T-shirts, mugs, and caps and all that stuff. And this is somebody who had gone from being someone who generally you'd think when, that he was in the prison system and that's where he would spend his life, right? That he'd get out and he would go back in. But this guy ended up, living in an incredible about 4 years of doing this kind of work before he died. And but having a huge impact on the neighborhood, whereas most people had considered just kind of dismissing him. quickly, this is a woman who was in our transitional housing program for young mothers, an activist, homeless, very tough, tough person who signed up for our Young Mothers program, which I didn't want to. I didn't think she would be good for it because she was from this kind of black nationalist ideology, and she couldn't. I didn't think she could deal with the diversity of Project Row Houses. But the folks running it, they decided to give her a chance. She came into the program. She was on academic probation at University of Houston. She ended up finishing there, doing so well that the faculty supported her and helped her get herself ready to apply to graduate school. She ended up getting a full scholarship to a PhD program at Penn State, in which she completed. She ended up teaching at the University of Pittsburgh for a few years until she decided she wanted to come back to Houston and serve the neighborhood that helped her. And when she came back, I ended up telling the mayor, the mayor at the time, about her, and the mayor thought, I should meet with her and I should see if we can kind of, see if we can take advantage of her experience and her knowledge and all this stuff. And so she did meet with her, and then all of a sudden the mayor appointed her as a member of the Houston Housing Authority, which is a very large, that's a big industry that deals mainly is usually contractors that are, or developers who are kind of doing this because they're kind of divvying up who's going to do the contracting on the housing and stuff. And so she took that role. She rose to vice chair. She was actually the chairperson of the housing transition effort for our current mayor. She's so well respected in the city now. Let's skip this one because I'm running out of time. I want to start though. I want to go back. Well, let me just go back and just say though, the reason I can't really talk about these, I don't have time, but this was my first seed of interest of thinking about kind of entrepreneurship. This was in Anyang, Korea, and I learned some things there that I ended up going back to Houston and would start doing small business incubating in Houston, but that's a whole other story. But that was the beginning of my thinking about commerce, and entrepreneurship. Now, we all know about Wall Street, right? I mean, Wall Street is the king of commerce, right, in the world. And it's, New York City is nice and clean, it's big, it's powerful, the money is big money, right? That's the way they kind of think of it there, and it's bullish, it's all of that. But at the same time, I was just a year ago, about a year ago, I was invited to Tulsa to talk to them about the centennial of the Tulsa riots. I knew a little bit about that, and I knew a little bit about these Black Wall Street communities. And the Black Wall Street community is a little bit less robust than Wall Street. And it's it's an interesting kind of difference there, in that Wall Street is all about power, it's about exploitation, it's all about. But these Black Wall Streets is just about how do Black people sustain themselves, and in a place where they were segregated out, there was no opportunity. So how does that happen? And so as I started to get involved in this thing and start thinking about Black Wall Street, and the Tulsa massacre. I have to say this honestly. I mean, I was not so enthralled with the idea of the massacre because it's heavy. It's like I'm really much more interested in how do we do things that move the issue forward. That's what I'm. And but I know it's important to honor these historical times. And but most people when they talk about Black Wall Street or the Tulsa massacre. Well, of course, the massacre was all about destruction, but Black Wall Street, people only think about this part of the destruction part, but they don't think about the part where that actually after the massacre, those people went back and they rebuilt their neighborhood bigger against all the obstacles that were placed on them. I mean, the terror of going back to a place where you've been burned out, the insurance companies not paying the insurance claims, and all tougher building requirements, all these things to keep people out, but they did it. And I'm like, that to me is the thing I think that's You know, that's the thing of the 21st century. You know, because black neighborhoods now are doing probably worse than they have, you know, since we started having black neighborhoods, you know, since, you know, and thinking about it from a historical standpoint, all the different things that have happened from, you know, after emancipation, you know, from the, you know, the Freedmen's Bureau through the New Deal and all kinds of things that have happened, it's always fallen short. And so, the shameful thing about it right now, though, is that, I mean, for me, going into this research and looking at it now, is that there were more things happening trying to shore up and give some stability to black economies prior to the 1970s than we've seen at all. I mean, we haven't seen anything, any kind of movement since the 1970s that focus on the economic viability of black people in black neighborhoods, and which is really interesting, because we're in a very interesting moment in time now where on a national level people are talking about reparations. Nobody knows what that means, but it's being talked about, right? So it's interesting to think about this notion of Black Wall Street in the 21st century at this time. Yeah, I'm not going to spend time talking about this destruction of the original neighborhood, and yeah, I'm not going to spend any time on that, but I'm going to just move on to say that this was really a powerful quote that I read in a book that Suzanne Wallace did, where Michael Wallace did the introduction. It was like, you know, but the ashes and the blood of the ravaged 35 blocks of Greenwood were stirred into a mortar of resilience that bound people together and kept hope alive. You know, to me, that's like it's a powerful statement to think about how in the face of such destruction, there was a reason for people to come together. And so how do you do that now? And I think that, you know, as folks have talked about the arts and stuff, you know, the arts can be a great tool for kind of binding people together and stuff. And so this project, I mean, as we're thinking about it, we were very fortunate to get this Bloomberg resources, but we're looking at, you know, doing some discrete projects and stuff in different locations and places and working with artists to do that. But I also, you know, but I'm also interested in this more social sculptural aspect. And I'm going to, you know, and as I said with Project Row Houses, you know, started with these old houses, and I was able to stitch that together with this idea of John Bigger's language about shotgun houses. Then was able to connect that to this kind of broader movement of people coming together to build something. So I'm going to give you just an example of how that plays out in real time, right? This is happening now. I don't know how this is going to play out in the end, but I'm just going to tell you this story here. That during my meetings here, I met this guy, this young man here, who was a very interesting entrepreneur, artist. He had managed to teach himself how to do terracotta and got a contract to restore all the terracotta on this major building downtown Tulsa. And it was like, to me, I was so inspired by that, because it just kind of reminded me, I'm in Tulsa, and this is somebody who is just incredibly inspiring and resourceful and resilient, that he's figuring this stuff out. Then a few nights later, I had dinner with this woman here, Suzanne Wallace, who had just written a book about Art Deco Tulsa, and educating me on the value of Art Deco in Tulsa, and that it's such a big deal. So I thought, that's interesting. But then a few days later, I ended up going to a meeting with the architects that are looking at expanding the Greenwood Cultural Center. And notice how the Cultural Center sits off the street here, and you notice when the image of the old Greenwood map, you know, the streets were aligned with businesses all here, and I was really shocked when they showed me their plans, and the plans were about expanding, you know, kind of back in the back, and I didn't think it just didn't make sense for me. And I know what happened. I know that the clients, most of the people that are working at the Cultural Center, they're older, they're traditional, whatever, and you know, and they weren't pushing it, right? And so they allowed them to design this thing that, to me, quite frankly, was like a shopping mall. You know, it's just one way in, and you move around in there, and then you go out. And I was like, this is an opportunity to go to the street. You got to pull things to the street. And so they got excited about it. And so we started doing it and talking about going to the street. And so they're going to look at kind of building things on the street. And then someone else called my attention to this particular place here. This is a block that was rebuilt after the ride. In fact, this building was rebuilt in 1922, so just a year after. But this one was peculiar because they used charred stone, brick from the fire on the facet of that. And I thought, it was really interesting, but somebody said, well, if they're going to do a new building facing Greenwood, maybe we could make the bricks for that facade. And then so it just kind of occurred to me, this whole notion of how do you merge these things together? There's the entrepreneurship of the young man who's interested in making, who's doing terracotta and stuff, and then you've got the terracotta, the Art Deco stuff. And so I thought, maybe there's an opportunity to do a 21st century Art Deco of Tulsa, and so we're trying to work that out and think about if that's possible, if we can build a studio that would actually lead to some kind of entrepreneurial effort that would reflect back on and mimic this whole notion of Black Wall Street, the vibrancy of that. Now, that's the end of my presentation, but I want to close with something though that I just thought was really interesting, that the mayor earlier, the former mayor of Oklahoma City, talked about how the gathering place in Tulsa, it is an amazing thing. I've been there. It's an amazing place. And he talked about the economic impact it's going to have on the city, and it will. And they spent $450 million on it, right? And I couldn't help but, it was interesting that he said that, because I wasn't going to talk about this, but I just remember thinking when I went there to this park, and I'm there to work on the centennial of Black Wall Street, Tulsa, the Greenwood neighborhood. Then I go to this park, which is magnificent. And I started thinking, now, if they start thinking about that 10 years ago, maybe, I don't know how long ago they start thinking about it, but they're thinking about something they're going to invest $450 million in. And, and they want to have an economic impact for the city on that. I started thinking, now that's the path they went, and they got what they got. But I thought, wonder what would have happened if 10 years ago they said, we're going to raise $450 million, and we're going to use that $450 million to see if we can leverage what Black Wall Street was, a place where it signaled to people that there was economic opportunities for African Americans, which will bring people from all over the country there. I couldn't help but think about that, and wonder what the economic impact of that would be, of a city in the U.S. right now that's placing itself specifically around, framing itself as a place that it wants to value the entrepreneurial efforts of African Americans in their city to grow it. My sense is that the value of that would be so much greater than the value of that park's going to bring them at this time. But that's just my view. Thank you.
Okay, that wraps up our presentations for the day. One more round of applause for Rick and all of our presenters.